It's 1970 in a quiet suburb of Los Angeles. A horrific story comes to light. A little girl hobbles into a Los Angeles County welfare office, battered and abused. The child had a curious way of holding up her hands, like a rabbit. She looked about 6 or 7 years old. Her mother, stricken with cataracts, was seeking an office with services for the blind and had entered the wrong room. But this poor little girl transfixed everyone who saw her. At first they assumed she had autism. Then they discovered she couldn't talk. She had 2 nearly complete sets of teeth, a rare dental condition. She could barely chew or swallow and could not fully focus her eyes or extend her limbs. She weighed just 59 pounds. The little girl was 13 years old. The name given by doctors to protect her identity was Genie.
Mr. Wiley?
Yes.
Why did you keep your daughter in a room?
Mr. Wiley has no comment.
No comment.
We haven't had time to discuss the charge. We haven't even seen.
This story begins with Genie's father, Clark Wiley. He grew up in a foster home in the Pacific Northwest and worked as a machinist on aircraft assembly lines in LA during and after the Second World War. He married Irene Oglesby, a migrant worker 20 years younger than him. Clark was a controlling man who hated noise, so he never really wanted children, yet children came. The first, a baby girl, who died after being left in a cold garage. A second child died from birth complications, and a third, a boy named John. Clark Wiley had a rough childhood. After the death of his father and his mother running a brothel, he was neglected and ended up going from foster home to foster home. It's thought that the neglect from his mother made him resent her. However, during his early adulthood, mother and son became close. She was trying to make up for past mistakes and tried spending as much time as she could with him. Seeing as his mother was finally taking note of him, Clark became extremely attached to her, putting her above everyone else. Genie's mother, Irene, was 20 years younger than Clark. As a child, she sustained a head injury, which affected her eyesight, and her condition would only get worse with time. When the couple got married, neighbors and friends remember them being close and seemingly happy. However, behind closed doors, Clark soon became violent towards Irene. His severe beatings affected Irene's vision even more until she was partially blind and heavily dependent on Clark. Clark was controlling and rigid, and it was only becoming worse over the years. He didn't like children claiming they were noisy. Clark had begun to isolate himself more and more, and not only that, he kept his family isolated as well, preventing his wife and son from leaving if it wasn't absolutely necessary. When their son was 5 years old, they had another baby, a girl this time. Genie Wiley was born in 1957. Although seemingly healthy, she had a hip dislocation, discovered at a checkup when she was only 3 months old. So she was required to wear a splint for most of her first year of her life. This caused her to start walking later than other children. She also showed some trouble introducing solid foods into her diet, causing her weight to always be below average, sometimes even showing signs of malnutrition. These challenges at such an early age caused Clark to think his daughter had mental disability. Although Genie had not shown any medical signs of any delays in mental development, but Clark was determined she was disabled and actually told his wife and son they should not speak to her and pay her little attention. Clark didn't like any of the hassle that came with taking care of children, so he thought caring for a mentally challenged child was not something he was going to take part in. The neglect caused her to continue dropping weight and delayed her development severely. At 14 months old, she contracted pneumonia. The doctor who saw her mentioned the possibility that she was indeed disabled in some way. Although it was never officially diagnosed, it didn't even cross his mind that her condition was inflicted by bad parenting and neglect. So with this theory from the doctor, Jenny's father just confirmed what he had been saying all along and began treating his daughter as if her condition was much more severe. When Jenny was about to turn 2 years old, a drunk driver hit Clark's mother, killing her almost instantly. She had been walking out with Jenny's brother at the time, who suffered no injuries. The driver only received probationary sentence, and with this news, Clark was completely destroyed. He felt society had failed him, and he even went as far as to blame the accident on the 7-year-old son, just because he'd been walking with his grandmother. He became paranoid, and his isolation spiraled out of control. The family moved into Clark's mother's house and quickly began losing contact with neighbors and family. Clark thought he had to protect his family from the dangers outside, so he prevented them from leaving. This feeling of protection was also mixed with the disappointment he felt from having a mentally disabled child, which is what he established Genie was. So as well as preventing his family from leaving, he began to lock Genie away to keep her hidden. Soon enough, Genie was confined to a second bedroom in the house, while the rest of the family lived in the living room. Clark told everyone that his mother's room was not to be touched. Clark slept on a recliner. Irene slept in a dining room chair, and the son was left to sleep on the floor. Genie's room was dark, with blacked out windows, and the only objects Genie interacted with were her crib, a chair, and some curtains, and a child's toilet. During the day, Genie would be strapped to the toilet with a makeshift harness Clark had made himself. At night, he'd tie her to a sleeping bag and put a metal cover over her crib, meaning Genie never stood up and can barely move her arms or legs. While most children are beginning to run, climb, fall over, and get up again, Genie wasn't able to get up on her own 2 feet. Clark didn't like children making noise, so he kept a wooden stick in the room, and if Genie ever made a sound, he beat her with it. He also began imitating a dog's behavior, growling, barking, and even scratching Genie if she cried or made any noise. Genie was fed mainly baby foods and liquids, and was always fed by her father or her brother. Irene's sight was worse than ever, so she wasn't allowed to feed Genie. According to researchers, Genie was probably fed very quickly, and if she choked or complained in any way, her father would take away the food or even rub it in her face. Knowing this, her mother would try to smuggle food in for her in the middle of the night, but most importantly, Genie was never spoken to. The house was always silent. Clark despised noise and prevented his wife and son from even talking to each other. Speaking to Genie was explicitly prohibited. Any conversations that had were always away from Genie's room. So for the years she was locked away, Genie barely heard any words spoken to her, which meant she could never learn how to speak herself. Although Genie suffered the strongest form of abuse, the rest of the family was subject to Clark's ways as well. He frequently beat his wife and son, especially if they made noise or tried to speak to Genie. Clark kept a diary where he detailed his abuse and authority over his family. They were forbidden to leave the house unless it was necessary, and Genie's brother was only allowed to go to school, and when he came back, he had to confirm his identity before being let back in due to Clark's severe paranoia. The neighbors knew the family didn't leave the house much, but they had no idea of the extent of what was going on behind closed doors. Many didn't know of the existence of Genie. The neighbors believed the couple had only one child. So when the doors to the house were finally opened, nobody could even possibly imagine the truth of what had been going on inside. After years of threats and violence, Irene finally confronted her husband about not being able to call her parents. Genie was 13 years old at the time, and her brother, who was already 18, had run away from home. Genie's mother was finally able to leave and immediately took Genie to her parents' house. At this point, Irene was nearly blind and decided to apply for disability benefits. She took Genie with her while she was requesting the paperwork. but Jeannie immediately caught the eye of a social worker passing by. The social worker contacted police, and Jeannie's parents were arrested and charged with willful abuse. 15 minutes before he was due in court, Clark put a gun to his head and ended his life. But the damage to Jeannie was already done.
This morning, the authorities reported that 70-year-old Clark Wiley shot and killed himself just before he was to go to court and be arraigned for child abuse.
Jeannie was taken to the Los Angeles Children's Hospital and put under observation by therapists who specialize in child abuse. They began trying to find out more about what led to Jeannie's state, but they could only rely on what their mother told them, since Jeannie wasn't taken to any doctors after the age of 2. Doctors say that this was nothing like they'd ever seen before. Jeannie was very small for her age, barely 59 pounds. Her skin was extremely pale because of the lack of sunlight, and since she never learned how to chew because she was never given solid food, her baby teeth hadn't fallen out. She had 2 full sets of teeth. In fact, when given solid food, she couldn't chew it and ended up spitting it out and trying to break it down with her hands. Jeannie had barely any muscles on her legs, and her bones were very weak since she'd never learned to walk properly. She couldn't stand up straight and always walked with her hands placed in front of her arms, close to her body, similar to how a rabbit would place his front paws. Her rib cage was smaller than average, and her hips were not developed correctly. Jeannie had never been toilet trained. She had either been tied to a toilet or forced to use diapers for 13 years. Her vision initially seemed fine, but she wasn't able to focus on things more than a few feet away from her, since she had always been in a small room and never any open spaces. Doctors determined Jeannie's cognitive abilities were equal to a 13-month-old. Her communication consisted of making noises by pushing objects to attract attention, but no verbal or body language. She only seemed to respond to her name, but barely any other phrases. So doctors couldn't determine how much of it she knew before or she had learned during her time in observation. After studying her for weeks, doctors came to the conclusion that she was physically able to speak, but as a consequence of being extremely isolated and never exposed to language, she simply hadn't acquired a first language and had only learned to get attention through noises she could make with objects. This explains her lack of nonverbal body language as well. Since she barely communicated with anyone, she never learned how to gesture, or facial expressions or movements can also be a form of communication. So after weeks of therapy, observation, and several tests, doctors concluded Jeannie had not been born in any way mentally disabled. She wasn't autistic, and that her intelligence at the time of birth would have probably been average. Her mental abilities at the time she was found were due to the abuse and isolation of her father. Her physical condition was also a consequence of the neglect and abuse inflicted on her at the most crucial moments of development and growth for children. Jeannie made incredible progress in the short period she spent in the hospital. She began understanding when she was being talked to. She began showing emotions such as curiosity, and also began paying attention when someone was speaking. She also began putting on weight and going to the bathroom on her own, slowly becoming in control of her bladder. She also began to recognize the doctors who were treating her and would show happiness when they arrived, even trying to make them stay when it was time for them to leave. After months, she acquired enough vocabulary and understanding of emotions to express happiness or fear. She also slowly became more affectionate and began giving hugs to the people she trusted the most. She still had a hard time being in crowds, but when taken away from them, she would calm down. After spending a few months in recovery at the hospital, Jean Butler, Jeannie's special education teacher at the hospital, began fostering Jeannie for some time. The hospital didn't approve of this decision as they thought it could interfere with the study. But regardless, Jeannie moved in with Jean. In her journals, Butler wrote about the progress Jeannie made while at her home. She began expressing anger and frustration through words instead of attacking herself, and she was also much more talkative. Her language improved greatly. However, although her intentions were good, Butler's care did interfere with the overall study and therapy Genie needed, and she refused to cooperate with some of the specialists Genie needed to see. The other doctors thought Butler was keeping Genie's progress to herself in hopes that it would one day make her famous. The authorities decided she was not the best fit to gain full custody of Genie, and she was moved to a different home. Genie then began living with David Ringler, one of the therapists working on the case. Mrs. Ringler was a social worker and had a degree in human development, so the couple were both trained to observe Genie's progress. Although it was meant to be temporary, Genie ended up spending almost 4 years with the Ringlers and their children. During her stay with the Ringlers, Genie continued developing her verbal communication. At one point, Genie talked briefly about her childhood, meaning she had a memory of the events that happened to her in her earlier years. This is how Genie described how her father would beat her. Father hit arm, big wood. Genie cry, not spit. Father hit face, spit. Father hit big stick. Father is angry. Father hit Genie, big stick. Would hit, cry father, make me cry. Father is dead. And she was right. Clark Wiley was dead. Eventually, the charges against Irene were dropped, as police determined she was under abuse as well. In 1975, Genie turned 18. Her mother had been frequently visiting her during her time spent at foster homes, building a relationship with her. Irene's attorney, John Miner, was Genie's legal guardian. Although Genie was still living with the Ringlers when she turned 18, Genie moved back in with her mother into her childhood home, and legal guardianship was eventually transferred over to Irene. However, Genie's mother found it hard to cope with her behavior and quickly asked for help from the health department. Without consulting her therapist, she placed Genie in a series of different foster homes. She also sued the hospital therapists and workers who had participated in Genie's story, but the lawsuit never went to trial and was eventually dismissed. From 1977 to the early 90s, Genie was placed in many foster homes where she was abused, causing great impact in all of her improvements from the years before. Around 1993, she moved into a facility in an undisclosed location in Los Angeles, where she was finally doing better and being taken care of. She was allowed visits from her mother and the Ringlers, who stayed in contact with her regularly. Not much is known after that. There have been some articles and reports done on her story, and journalists have been able to contact her a handful of times, but not much is reported. She's living a simple life in a private facility, and her privacy is still respected. Genie's mother died at the age of 87 in 2003, and her brother went on to live his own life after running away from home. He refused to read anything about Genie, and only
Arcadia have taken custody of a 13-year-old girl, and they say was kept in such isolation by her parents that she never even learned to talk. Her elderly parents have been charged with child abuse.
It was a family that once was, that fell apart. After time's gone by and I put a family together, and you know, I don't have the hurt that I used to have. And I'm happy for my sister for getting all the attention she's gotten and all the help, professional help. They weren't very educated people, they weren't outspoken, they didn't mingle with people. It's just, and I have a little resentment for that. The fear of my upbringing not being what I expected it to be. I mean, at that point in time, I didn't know what to expect. Okay, but later in life, you know, I would have expected a lot more from my parents than what they gave me. They didn't give me the tools of knowledge to get out and feel comfortable about accomplishment and setting goals. And they didn't teach me about the Bible and its teachings and God. I didn't really know there was a God. I feel like at times that God's failed me, and maybe He has, and maybe He hasn't. You know, I'm alive. I've enjoyed a lot of things. God's given me that. You know, God hasn't really failed me. I might have failed Him, since, you know, I've let all this time go by, but it's never too late.